You know, as adults, we can be so hypocritical at times. Here we are having these big expectations for kids to control their emotions, and yet we can't do it ourselves. I don't know how many times you've yelled in traffic or spiraled out of control over an email or lost sleep or said something stupid to someone when you were emotional. And the funny thing is that as adults, our prefrontal cortex is already developed. And so we should be in better control of our emotions than our kids are. Which brings me to the topic of this Saturday's Walk and Talk. Welcome to this Saturday's Walk and Talk. And today we're going to talk about breathing and how breathing is the key to us making rational decisions instead of irrational decisions, so that we can think more logically and with more common sense and not say or do stupid things when we're emotional. So one of the things that we have to really understand first and foremost is that emotions and our brains are inherently connected, and our emotions can hijack our brain anytime. And it's a really, really difficult thing for us as adults to control, like I said. And it's even more difficult for kids to control because their brains aren't developed. So the most effective tool to deal with an emotional hijacking is breathing. And the reason why breathing is so important, or the science behind breathing, is quite simple. When you take deep diaphragmatic breaths, so your diaphragm is kind of right underneath your belly button, you take those deep diaphragmatic breaths, it automatically starts to soothe your polyvagal nerve. And your polyvagal nerve runs through our entire bodies, and it's connected to our amygdala and all the other parts of our brain, which I don't know. And to keep it simple, because I'm not a brain scientist, we're going to talk about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and of course the polyvagal nerve. When our child's brain, or our brain for that matter, gets hijacked emotionally, the first thing that we need to do is we need to take those deep diaphragmatic breaths, because that soothes our polyvagal nerve, and then that soothes our amygdala. Because what happens when our brain gets hijacked emotionally is our brain, our amygdala, goes into survival mode. And I've talked about that numerous times, about our amygdala controlling the fight, flight, and freeze response, which basically keeps us alive, and we need that. So for example, here I'm out here hiking in the bush. Thank God the bears are hibernating right now. But who knows if a big bad wolf is going to come flying out of the trees. Actually, are wolves even in this area? I think they are. I think some ranchers have mentioned that they've seen some wolves come down this far. Anyways, I'm pretty safe right now, so my amygdala shouldn't jump in and go into survival mode. But what breathing does is it calms our polyvagal nerve, which then calms our amygdala, which then helps us soothe ourselves away from that survival mode and gets us back to being in a more reasonable, rational frame of mind. So when our amygdala is in survival mode and we're triggered, the last thing that we want to do is start lecturing our kids or negotiating with our kids or trying to tell them to snap out of it, because ultimately that's not going to change the state that they're in. The only thing that's going to change it is by them taking deep breaths, like I said, to calm the polyvagal nerve and their amygdala. So your reaction as a parent or a teacher or any adult that's being confronted with a kid who's emotional is to simply say, okay, take deep breaths, and then model it. A couple of the ones that we use at my school is we do bumblebee breathing, we do snake breathing. You know, for example, if I'm going to model that with a kid, and it happens all the time, I probably have about, 5 to 10 kids that I interact with every day. They come to the calming place. I don't have a principal's office, so they come to the calming place or in the hallway or wherever, and teachers do it too. But, I'll dive into, okay, let's take some deep breaths. Bzzz. One more time, deep breath. Bzzz. And then snake breathing is simple too. So those are a couple of fun breathing activities that we use at our school, and there's a lot more that we use. And as a matter of fact, little plug here, I did write a book called And Breathe that you can check out on Amazon, and it's got like 50 fun breathing strategies in it that you can practice with your kids. My colleague Robin wrote a book called Breathe Deeper, which is also on Amazon, which gives you some breathing strategies that you can use at home or in your classrooms or whatnot. What we want to do is we want to get into the habit of telling our kids to breathe and taking those deep breaths right away. And if we start really early, even when your kids are 2 years old, 3 years old, and if you model that and you say take deep breaths, it's going to stick and it's going to become something that's natural and habitual for them. And you know, you can imagine, I mean, I'm just going to go back to my school. We have 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and so on, that right away when they start feeling emotional, they'll start taking deep breaths to soothe themselves, you know. And if they don't, we remind them, they'll instantly go into it because it's something that we formed a habit for. It's something that we've established in our school. It's a routine that we do, that whenever we feel those big emotions, whether it's being angry, frustrated, sad, embarrassed, feeling some grief, right away we get our kids to take deep breaths and work through that. And all of us know that physiologically it takes 20 minutes for a person to calm. And so you can imagine what that looks like if you're not breathing. It could take up to 30 minutes, and if you're breathing it could take 10 to 15 minutes. But on average it takes about 20 minutes for the human brain to physiologically calm itself, so that way it can re-engage its prefrontal cortex and get out of that survival mode. You know, and if we don't, and you've all seen it, if we don't engage breathing, we're going to have kids who are less rational, less logical, more impulsive, quicker to temper tantrums, and they're not going to hear feedback. When kids or adults are in that emotional state where their emotions have hijacked their brain, we're not hearing things, we're not listening. We're literally in fight, flight, and freeze mode, and that kind of takes over our reasoning and our rational, we're common sense, logical part of our brain. The key is that we need to be purposeful with ourselves and our kids and not think that breathing is this hokey, woo-woo, you know, rainbows and unicorns, meditative, fluffy stuff, when it really is science. And teaching our kids to take deep breaths early is only going to serve them well as they turn into adults. You know, when we take deep breaths when things get tough, it allows us to step away from conversations. It allows us to step away from a conflict. It allows us to take that moment before we say or do something stupid. And so just to jump back into the brain science behind it, so when we take those deep breaths and we soothe our amygdala that's in survival mode, what it does is it re-engages our prefrontal cortex. So your prefrontal cortex controls your decision making, your problem solving, your planning, your ability to reason. It helps you with social interactions. It gives you your confidence and your strength to persevere through things. And so it's all science. And so breathing really is simply science. And as much as we want to say emotional reaction is not something that's tangible, it is. It's physiological. And so if our prefrontal cortex is re-engaged, that's when we can work with logic and common sense and rationality, and you know, we avoid those irrational moments. And like you, I have had moments where I've done and said stupid things when I've been emotional, you know, when I've gotten upset, and I'm guilty of wearing my heart on my sleeve. And a lot of people are. I mean, I see a lot of people with tattoos of hearts on their forearms because they wear their emotions on their sleeve. So the next kind of question, I guess, that some of you are probably thinking is, well, how do we go about teaching breathing? I mean, you can always use teachable moments whenever somebody gets emotional, and you know, once, you know, breathing is established and becomes routine, it's really easy to just jump onto those moments where somebody's emotional to say just breathe or to model that breathing. But one of the best ways to teach kids to breathe and to self-soothe and to self-regulate is through play. And a lot of you guys know I used to be the play is the way guy, and play is the way is no longer in existence. But the best way still to this day is to teach breathing through play. There's nothing like using a game to control the environment, so that way you can elicit emotion and behavior in small doses, so that way you can jump in and teach some breathing while you're in control. I also wrote a book called Let's Play Bruh, with 50 games that you can use at home or in school that can help you do some structured play and then teach your kids how to breathe and self-regulate and all those good things for play. And while you're using play to do that, you're using that structured play piece, that's where you can explicitly teach about the polyvagal nerve, about the amygdala, about the prefrontal cortex, and about breathing and how it reacts to your body. And, and when you're playing games with kids, as they start to master their emotions during play, you can make games increasingly more difficult. So that way you're challenging their emotional well-being and always upping the ante. So that way they have to continually learn to take deep breaths. And again, that's where, that book that I have, the And Breathe book, or Robin's Breathe Deeper book, come into play, because, when you're doing that continually, it works like a charm. At my school, for example, our Monday mornings, we start with the drum and some dancing and then some recognitions. And then I typically play a game to get kids into the groove of taking deep breaths, because there's no better way to teach something than through play, because who doesn't love learning through play? Holy shit. I thought someone was coming after me. Also, I'm going to brag about my school again. We have 2 recesses at my school, because free play or unstructured play is another place where kids are playing and they're being more creative, and they're kind of in a position where they have to work through conflict and whatnot. And that's another great place for kids to learn to take deep breaths. And that's where co-regulation is kind of even bigger, is during the free play, because the teachable moments are there. But if your kids are outside playing and you see them kind of get into a conflict, you can yell out the window, take some deep breaths, work through this, do some snake breathing, do some pizza breathing, do some hot chocolate breathing. And so the end result of teaching breathing early and teaching the science behind it early, and don't think that your kids can't learn the brain science at 3, 4, 5 years old. They may not be able to say the words amygdala, prefrontal cortex, polyvagal. They almost say it better than they say my name. They still call me Wee Woy. Yes, my kids don't call me Mr. Slancy. They call me Leroy. But that's besides the point. But at the end of the day, if you teach that early, if you start teaching that at 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, can you imagine how easy it'll be for your kids to deal with conflict or deal with tough things when they're in grade 2, when they're in grade 4, when they're in grade 6, when they're, in grade 8, 9. And here's the key thing for parents. The sooner that we can teach our kids to take deep breaths and think rationally and logically, it sets a foundation up for when they do become teenagers and they have more independence and freedom, and they're not with us all the time, and we don't get to kind of manage their friends and whatnot. It allows them to be naturally, organically ready for those difficult situations around drugs or alcohol or some of those other things that they'll step into. And so that's what it does. And yes, when they're teenagers, they're still going to do stupid things. They're still going to make the wrong decisions, just like we do as parents. But at the end of the day, when you provide that foundation, they're going to have a better shot as teenagers being able to do the right thing instead of the wrong thing, because the better they are at taking deep breaths and making sure their prefrontal cortex is in charge instead of making emotional decisions, the more chance your kids are going to have at being healthy and move on. And the key is, being somebody who's just about through the phases of raising teenagers, they're still going to be stubborn. They're still going to fight us every step of the way. And we still have to pull back. And we have to kind of force ourselves on them sometimes. But you have to trust that when they come out the other end, they're going to be great adults. And, I look at my kids, and they've both had certain struggles that were different, but they're sure turning into amazing human beings. And that goes for a lot of the kids that I've taught over the years. Man, there's some really great human beings. And, I see a lot of my former students who are now parents, and they're just great people. And, and over the years, going way back to when I first started at Central and we talked about breathing and all this stuff, it sure pays off. So at the end of the day, Stick to it, make it a habit, make it a part of your own self-awareness and self-regulation as adults, because emotional intelligence is key, and that's what this is all about. There's a science behind it. And on that note, peace out, my friends. See you next time.